Brilliant. And we're live, Arjen. So, welcome everyone. Final session from firefighting to sustainable contract management. So, an exciting one, isn't it? What do you think?
Definite, definitely. This is definitely a closure of a great set of three talks about contract management, burnout, leadership, and all these other things that go with it. So really looking forward to today, Volker. Hope
Yeah,
you're looking forward to it as well.
always looking forward to it. Nothing more to look forward to than on a Friday to talk about firefighting to sustainable contract management.
Well, yeah.
No, it's been a journey, and I know obviously we talked about that earlier. It's going to be a shorter one. It's kind of like just more of a wrap up today of all the thoughts we had. So we have the intro slides. I don't think we need them to be honest. I think everyone now knows who we are. If
Yeah,
not,
by now they should, yeah.
yeah, if you're first timer here, just go on our LinkedIn profiles, have a look, have a nose. But in a nutshell, I'm an executive coach. I talk a lot on resilience and burnout prevention. That's how the two of us met. Just signed up another conference. I'm speaking to some CTOs actually later on this year in the fintech space around the same topic.
Yeah, and I'm Arjen, and I am one of the people that's engaged with CAT-CM and a very vivid fan of everything contract management. And as Volker said, we met on this contract management conference and we both realized that, oh boy, there are so many contract managers living in stress. And we started thinking like, how can we help you all? So the third webinar, uh,
Yeah.
let's see if we can find some solutions for you guys.
So let me kick off. If There we go. If Microsoft lets me change the slides. So it's a final session from reality. If I say we start from reality, right? And many leaders and practitioners already recognize contract management is often being held together by people rather than by design, right? And I think we spent most of the first webinar on that. So teams are compensating for unclear mandates, broken handovers, weak escalation routes, and incomplete process disciplines. And as I kind of talk about this, I'm thinking of a course I'm holding at the moment, a leadership alignment accelerator. And I just did the chapter on communication and on clarity, right? It's the same. It's, be clear on what we're doing. On the surface, it's always the same. Organizations are coping, the contracts are managed, right? The issues are being resolved, and customers, they might not see what, if I say what what's happening behind the scenes, right? But internally, there's an the apparent stability comes at a cost. And that's where, we talked about heroism, right? That cost is usually carried by a small number of highly capable individuals who absorb the complexity, they patch the gaps and keep things moving through personal effort. So the problem is that this model is not resilient, right? And that's where the whole resilience comes in, right? It creates burnout, concerned knowledge with only, or concentrated knowledge with just a few people. And it leaves the organization vulnerable. When just let's say that key person leaves, it's just could be, if I say, make or break basically for the organization, right? Um, so this session is, if I say, it's not about theory, it's more how do we move from this theory into a model of permanent firefight or away from permanent firefighting, a bit more structure and sustainable performance for your teams. So I think the next slide is, yeah, it's still me. So the core argument of this session is simple but demanding. And I hate to break the news, right? But there is no silver bullet for this, right? There's not like, oh yeah, whoop, magic wand, we can fix it. Organizations often look for a single intervention that will make contract management easier, right? They invest in a new platform, they launch a training program, restructure the team, or rewrite the workflow. Each of these, of course, help to a certain extent, but none will work in isolation if the rest of the system remains unchanged, right? And that's exactly where the firefighting comes in, right? We're fighting a fire here, fighting a fire there. The bigger fire is still smoldering away, right? And that matters because the problems are all interconnected. All these fires are interconnected. So better process will fail inside a culture that rewards workarounds. Better training will not stick if people still lack authority. And as they often do in contract management, they lack time. So new technology will automate poor decisions if the underlying governance remains unclear. So software alone does not solve contract management challenges. The value, again, comes from integrating methodologies, processes, and the technology. So the real task is to treat contract management as an organizational capability, not as a tool problem or a staffing problem alone. So that's really where we are. But I hand over to you to
Yeah.
talk about what sustainability really means.
Yeah. A lot of people think that the first step to take is to make sure that we reduce complexity. Well, let's be honest, complexity is not going to be eliminated. And actually, the complexity of orchestrating everything that happens at the boundaries of your organizations, and where you buy or sell something, is definitely will something that will become more complex. There are new players, more things you buy from different vendors. Let's not even talk about the shocks to the system. It's not going to eliminate complexity, but in order to manage it, you need to make sure that you make the transformation from reactive to proactive, which means you need to understand there's always going to be tension, but if you give the tension the right attention, sounds almost like a quote, then actually what will happen is that you have the power, the capability to actually reduce your dependency. And it's not just a dependency in your own stuff, it's also the dependency in what you're doing in the contract. And let's be honest, a significant part of what we do in contract management is not requiring exceptional effort, but it requires things like constant changing and constant chasing. A typical example, for instance, you have these suppliers and they need to deliver their ISO certification and they don't deliver. You need to call them again. They don't deliver. You need to call them again. Those are not exceptional effort, but it requires something else on an exceptional level is perseverance. Don't stop, don't get demotivated, and get it going. And that means that being resilient and being sustainable and being ready for it means that it should move away from everything being done last minute. Ooh, this contract is going to expire in 1 week. We need to find a replacement. Let's do something. Bad planning usually leads to bad execution, and bad processes usually lead to the fact that people need to do all kinds of things that are not exactly what they should be doing, but they're doing to make sure that the business keeps on going. Because that's one of the things that I find in so many contract managers. Actually, the will to make sure that the business succeeds, and therefore they feel that alignment with the business, and therefore they go the extra mile. But if you are continuously going the extra mile, yeah, that's not sustainable. You're going to break down. And I think maybe 10 to 15% of all people in contract management are currently facing that breakdown. And that's, of course, a tragedy. So if we then go on to the next slide, I always get the question is, what do we then need to do?
Yeah.
And then I usually make the joke, ask the first 100 employees you meet on the definition of a contract, the definition of contract management. What does procurement do? What does sales do? Who has what does legal do? Then the fun part is, out of this 100, probably the first 60 will already have a different definition on what a contract is. And if you start thinking about that, then everything else becomes in a perception level going completely wrong. So you really need to have a common language, a common framework. What's a contract? What's a contract manager? How does this process work? What's the process design? And there's enough best practices out there to actually do that. And we've trained thousands of people in this methodology, CAT-CM, but in the end, what it really brings is the common framework, the common language, the common understanding, which already saves you a lot of time because you don't need to explain everything. Then you need to drive in and say, let's take a few contracts and let's see what happens in practice. Not just the paper part, what did we agree, but what does actually happen in practice? Who does what? Who is involved? Who makes this decision? Who is the owner? Because that's one of the other funny part of contracts. Everybody touches them, but who really owns that contract? Who is accountable for the result? That's never the contract manager. The contract manager has the responsibility to make sure that those that are accountable can manage their accountability. So that means you need to test, and take 10, 15 contracts, not from just one category, but all over the organization. A few from IT, some from facility management, etc., and then actually live them and see what happens. And then what you will see is you'll find something like a fit gap analysis, which is the third step. The how do we actually want to have it and what's currently happening now, and where are the touch points, where are the things we need to fix, and it will automatically lead to some quick fixes. These quick fixes, as they are quick fixes, are not maybe your long-term solution, but they do help you to actually find the right things to do and work to on the future. And one of the things you will immediately find in that, and that's step number 4, is that means that you will probably need to clarify roles, mandates, escalations, etc., as soon as possible, based on multitudes of implementations I have seen on this topic. It really is the first thing that actually happens. Who has which role? Who has which mandate? How do we escalate? Who then makes decisions, etc., etc., etc. And that being said, it probably means that you will find that maybe 80% of your contract portfolio doesn't have a clear owner. There might be an account director, but is he or she also the owner of the sales contract? There might be a contract manager or maybe even a supplier manager, but they are not the ones that are accountable for the contract. They are the ones that actually make sure we do something. And finding that, usually having a very serious discussion with business leadership on, okay, we agreed this. How do you want your reporting? How do you want to be in space? What's your role going to be? How we're going to make your life as easy as possible? Because that's one of the important things in these kinds of transformations. Most reactions of people is, oh, more work. But actually what we're going to bring them is not necessarily more work, but the right work, and make sure that all the waste that they are doing can be taken out of the process. Then you are already in a stage where you can actually start building your documentation. Or how do we do things? What happens in the contracts? How do we aggregate? What's our knowledge infrastructure? Do we actually know where we are? This is also the point where you can really start thinking in bringing on technology to start helping you. The first ones, it is not going to be fixed by technology. Once you enter into stage 5, you can start thinking on technology and actually start capturing the stuff. And then actually a funny thing happens. Even a process has a Deming cycle. It needs to be reviewed. It needs to be adapted. It needs to be changed. It needs to improve. And that means you then go back to step 1 or step 2 and then go through these processes all over again. Because like a product, like anything within an organization, it is never finished. Improvement never stops you. There's always something to win about. And that's why this process fix is a nice first step to talk about. And if we can then move on.
Yeah. Let me talk about the culture fix, because as you say, right, the process fix is a great starting point. It's a continuous cycle, right? And the second part is the culture fix, right? And it is where many organizations usually stop short, because the process can be mapped. It's relatively easy, right? Documented, can be audited, but culture is harder to measure and easier to avoid. But the culture determines whether the process will actually survive the contact with reality, right? Because if people are rewarded for fixing crises, but not for preventing them, then we're back at firefighting, right? Because that becomes the operating model. And it doesn't matter what the process says, right? So we're literally going in circles here. So the required cultural shift is one in which people can surface risk early, right? Ask for support, point to structural problems without being blamed for them. Again, we're coming back to psychological safety here. We talked about that previously. And it depends heavily on the leadership behavior as well. Leaders set the tone by how they respond when someone raises an issue, right? So with curiosity, criticism, with support, or defensiveness, right? And again, this is example by example of psychological safety, right? How are you a good leader? How do you engage with your teams? How do you show empathy? And if leaders want better information and earlier warning, they have to create the conditions in which people feel safe and tell the truth about what they see, right? And again, the culture, I always say the culture starts on the top, right? It needs to trickle from the top down. And then last but not least, the third fix is the people fix, right? And this is about making sure that contract managers and commercial managers are set up to succeed in realistic terms, right? So too often what we see, individuals are made accountable for outcomes they cannot fully influence, right? Once they're lacking clear authority to act, which means that that combination, of course, creates frustration. It creates delay, defensive behavior. So people either escalate then too much because they feel exposed, or they escalate too little because they're trying to prove they can cope. So the solution is not simply to ask for better performance. It is to establish clarity. And I know I bang on about clarity, I think, in all the courses I'm doing. People need to know where their authority begins and ends, which is down to the culture, it's down to the process, right? But that fixes the people. You know, what are they truly responsible for? And you mentioned it as well, right? What decisions they can make and what escalations are required. They also need the right resources, tools, technology, and management attention to their professional growth, right? So how can they develop as an individual? So high performers still need clear conditions to perform well over time, right? So even if you have these top performers, you need to manage them properly. So integration, Arjen.
Yeah. So, as Volker said earlier, and I've stated as well, really need to understand that this is not just a standalone activity where you say, I'm going to train a few people, implement the process, and it works. No, it doesn't. It never does. Um, I know quite large organizations that sometimes have taken 5, 6, 7 years to get this totally fixed, get the culture changed from the extreme top to the extreme bottom to make sure that actually everybody is aligned and engaged. And it means that, as Volker said, change comes from the top. But every once in a while, it's also the fact that the bottom needs to be able to facilitate the needed change by also bringing suggestions. And so for me, this integration is not just let's convince leadership. No, it's also a chat that people in this field need to have with their leadership without being asked and being proactive in going it. Because if you mess up in process, in culture, in people, any of these three failing means the other ones will fumble. There's no discouragement about it. And then technology is going to support all of them because on the process level, it's going to automate that what can be automated. That's menial, that's handwork, that's costing time, etc. There's a gazillion business cases on technology out there. So if you want to know more, have fun. It's about supporting stuff. It's about supporting the people, about putting them in their most powerful position, but also it creates a culture of responsibility and accountability because everything becomes clear and it moves away from the heroics to predictiveness to proactiveness and means you can talk about rewarding other elements. And it also means that if you see this process is cross-functional. It doesn't care about your organizational silos. It's completely cross-functional. And the more cross-functional you go, that means that ownership of that cross-functional becomes vital. And let's be honest, if it's owned by procurement, then you get a procurement focus. If it's owned by legal, you get a legal focus. If it's owned by finance, you get a financial focus. So finding true ownership of this process probably means that you need to give the process ownership across the silos to somebody from the business because they are the ones that are working with the contracts. They are the ones accountable. They are the ones that suffer the consequences of non-performance. So they need to have the ownership of this process because this process facilitates the people in contract management, and the people in contract management will facilitate the business. So if ownership is unclear and not in the business, then this is going to face problems. And that means that this is not a cosmetic change. We said it's a real change and it's a systemic change, but this is a systemic change. And we're talking about ecosystems. There are billions of publications going right now about ecosystems and dependency, etc. But let me phrase it in a different way. Because in today's society, nobody can do it alone. If you're not alone, you do it with somebody else and you have a discussion and you agree on something what it's going to do. So that means that being alone, that no longer happens, will translate in doing it something else. That something else means that you need to write down what you agreed on and that you need to manage what you agreed on. And this clearly states that this is a systemic change. It's no longer about, oh, let's buy something or cool, we sold something. No. The future is about delivering on the expectations of the other party. That means executing. That means also, for instance, enabling your supplier to deliver or enabling, from a sales perspective, your client to undergo transformations and be within there. Contracts are no longer static artifacts in PDF in a mailbox, or even worse, somewhere filed in a cabinet where nobody knows which cabinet it actually is. No, these are going to be the documents that drive the infrastructure of success. And that is a real change. It's no longer an administrative function. It's no longer the function in the basement where the firefighter lives that only comes out when there is trouble.
Yeah.
No, they are going to move to the top floors. They are going to do something because in the end, I'm gonna say something funny. The chief executive officer, CEO, is probably going to become the chief ecosystem officer. And that means that this needs to transform and becomes part of the overarching strategy of the organization because you're not alone. So you better fix the fact that you're not alone and don't do it by firefighting, but do it for real in a process with culture and with people. Volker.
No, this is still yours. It's
It's
all.
still mine, still mine. So
Yeah,
okay, let's talk about the journey. Of course, this is not a linear process. We're going from A to B. No. You
yeah,
are at an A and you probably have no idea what your A is. So probably already the first problem in any kind of change is finding what the hell do we have today and what are we going to do with it and what's the perspective we want to have. And that's not going to be a linear, nice, gradual approach. No, it will be shocks. Sometimes a jump down. Sometimes you take 3 steps ahead and you need to take 2 steps back. It's going to happen. Realize, therefore, that structuring this is also going to get a lot of resistance. And this resistance is emotional. Because, yeah, we already work so nice with them and they always pick up the phone when we call them and yada, yada, yada. But at the end of the day, if they pick up the phone when you call, it usually means that you're calling because something isn't going well and going right. Or the other thing is that I experienced with a client that said, yeah, but if we're going to structure this process, am I then still going to be invited to all these supplier events? Well, to be honest, perhaps, perhaps not. Is it vital for you? Is it vital for the organization? That means that there will be resistance on levels you don't even expect now. People will feel perceived power loss. Well, it's not power loss. Actually, it is creating a very powerful structure, and being able to function in a powerful structure will make you more strong as an individual. And yes, of course, every crisis that's going to happen will have people ever going, yeah, let's go into firefighting again. And it's going to happen. But as long as it's temporarily, it's not that bad, but it should not be happening all the time. You should be prepared. You should have your scenarios. If you have the time, you can think on all the potential crises and risks that might happen, and therefore you have your countermeasures in place, which means that when something happens, you don't call the firefighter. you call the first domino stone, and they are going to execute the plan as we already thought about. Actually, there were organizations that actually had in their risk management, say the Hormuz Strait gets closed. They knew what they needed to do in minutes. And there are organizations that are still debating about it, what they're going to do about it. If you have good crisis management, it usually means that you plan well. If you look at real firefighters and in the army and in the police, they have all kinds of scenarios out there to actually make sure that when a crisis happens, everybody knows what he or she needs to do. And that means that the leadership that's required for that must be able to ask the uncomfortable question, not because you want to punish people, but because you want to improve stuff. And as we said earlier, transparency is one of the key elements. So transparency in communication means that you as a leader actually need to radiate the calmness, the fact that this is not about a cost-saving operation, this structuring. It's not about taking away authority. It's about making the organization more strong, more resilient, less susceptible for external shocks, and therefore better in control. And that means that this is a continuous process. So as I said earlier, this process owner is vital, but it also means that from a leadership perspective, progress needs to be something that's celebrated by every small step. It's about consistency. It's not about, oh, we implemented a new system. Let's have a champagne and talk with the supplier that gave us this new system. No, it's about continuously rewarding. It's about continuously giving it the right attention. And that's one of the pitfalls I see happening right now. Organizations implement the process, get it running, implement then software, so they get all these kind of nice dashboards on the executive level. And then all of a sudden they tend to forget that actually the people that got them there are the people that are still there, but are now doing different work, more relevant work than all this administrative stuff. But then again, there's the risk that they will be turned to the basement again. Never let that happen. And this consistency is actually about never send them back to the basement again. If we then can go to the next. So doing this structurally, and I said this, I think, several times, there is no hidden risk anymore because you have the transparency coming from the culture. Everybody wants to say, hey, this was actually happening. You actually have your warning signals. That actually means that stuff is going as planned and that you are much more adaptive, even much more agile, because most people think process and people, if you structure it, it becomes less agile. No, it becomes more agile because they know how to respond. They know what they can decide. They don't have to have gazillion meetings. That means that actually these teams will happen and do more. It also means that these teams that are then supported and feel comfortable and are allowed to function, that will really, really lower your attrition rate, both in sickness percentage, but also in people that are leaving. It also means that you have a way better commercial performance as an organization, because it doesn't matter if you buy or sell, all kinds of slack is going to be taken out of the equation. It becomes much faster, much more adaptable, much more resilient, and also much more able to adapt to change. And that means that on both sides of the aisles, contract management needs to be a strategic capability and not the basement capability we talked so much about. But let's be honest, we need to start with today. And today, we have a lot of heroes, we have a lot of firefighting. We have people that are locked in the basement and only allowed to get out when they need to go. But at the end of the day, we need to realize this. We need to realize that this function is grossly overstaffed in most organizations. We need to realize that in most organizations, there's a political fighting about who owns this process. Let's be honest, it's irrelevant at the end if everybody sticks to it, but the best way to start with it is give it to the business and make it their process. Same way as sales is actually a function that's vital for an organization, but operations need to deliver. So something sales sold that operation cannot actually execute on is an issue. And the other part is that I hear a lot of operations people say, yeah, but what procurement bought is not what we exactly need. Both cases for me are a clear indication of process ownership that's not in the business. Therefore, the sourcing is not in the business, the sales is not in the business, and therefore you get suboptimal results that never ever capture the maximum value of the engagement you wanted to do together. Because let's be honest, both sides are not alone in this world, and both sides need to deal with that. So recognize the position of today.
See, you just took that away from me, but that's fine.
Yeah, well, maybe I think maybe you have something to add on this as well. I think, but I'm
I
not
think
talking about the culture part, and I think the culture part is
yeah.
the other element that needs to be fixed here.
I think you summed it up very nicely, right? The purpose of the discussion that follows is to help leaders, right, and contract managers and commercial managers test that reality as you nicely described, to test it together. And often it's not this big programs, that's the first step, right? But it's this candid conversations. This again, I'm repeating myself, the clarity, the alignment, right? These conversations, about where heroics are masking structural weaknesses and what needs to change first. But I think that's a great way of concluding. Felt like you did most of the presenting today, so that's good. So we have a white paper coming soon. So stress is a system problem, building sustainable contract management practices. So we've been in the background writing on that. So given it's now mid-July, it's going to come out in August. You'll get another email when it's available for download. And yeah, so that's all from us today. So yeah, let's stop the recording and take some questions. But thank you very much for listening. And any questions, just reach out to us. LinkedIn is probably the easiest, or send us an email and we take it from there.
Yeah. So everybody, thanks for being here, and let's make the change happen.
Yeah.